the supplementary video for Chapter 6, Critical and Feminist Approaches to Organizational Communication. Lots of important stuff in this chapter, so be sure to look over this list so you know what to cover. This chapter marks an important shift in our understanding of organizational communication. Over the last 5 chapters, we've explored a variety of approaches to organizational communication, with key differences across each approach. But they still have a fairly common frame of reference, either a unitary frame of reference or a pluralistic frame of reference. A unitary frame of reference emphasizes common organizational goals, where conflict is rare and negative, and power is the natural prerogative of management. This is clearly the focus of classical approaches to organizational communication. In a pluralist frame of reference, organizations are seen as consisting of many groups with divergent interests. Conflict is inherent to organizing, and power is often contested. This is certainly the frame of reference for human relations and human resources approaches to organizational communication, as well as system and cultural approaches, and constitutive approaches for the most part. Theorists from all these approaches want to understand and explain organizations, and to some extent predict and control their behaviors. But none of them would seek to intervene in the organization and fundamentally change its operations or critique the underlying class struggles inherent to organizations. That requires a more radical frame of reference, and that's what critical and feminist approaches to organizational communication are all about. They see organizations as sites of domination, with inherent power differences that need to be overcome, and daily struggles over meaning and control. So critical and feminist approaches are mainly about transformation, not just understanding and explaining. First, let's look at critical approaches to organizational communication, which are rooted in a broad collection of ideas called critical theory, which arose from European universities in the mid-20th century, and itself is a response to the era of industrialization throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, heavily influenced by the writings of Karl Marx, a German intellectual who focused on the relationship between owners and workers in a capitalist society. There is a lot to say about critical theory that is beyond our purposes here. Look up critical theory sometime on Wikipedia to learn more. You can even take classes on critical theory here at CU. What we need to focus on here is that scholars who developed the ideas of critical theory were unanimous in their attention to power. If you remember one thing, though I'm sure you'll remember more, remember that critical theory and critical approaches to organizational communication are all about power. Critical theory is all about identifying power imbalances that are inherent in capitalistic systems, bringing attention to oppressed groups, and facilitating resistance or emancipation. Critical theorists see power as a defining, pervasive feature of organizational life. They take a more radical approach to studying organizations, seeking to uncover deep structures that produce and reproduce systemic power imbalances that privilege some and marginalize others. Now you might be thinking, what's all this theoretical nonsense about power and deep structures have to do with organizations and communication? I thought we were supposed to be learning how to communicate more effectively so organizations can be more successful. But that's exactly the point. Critical theorists would question that sort of taken-for-granted approach to organizational communication, instead saying that is just one approach to organizational communication, a managerial approach that privileges executive power and subordinates other interests in service of organizational goals that are, of course, defined by managers. Now, you don't have to be a Marxist or a socialist to appreciate this perspective, though it certainly helps. Just think about the tension between investing company profits back into employee training programs, salary increases, or infrastructure upgrades, versus using those same profits to pay shareholders a higher dividend or pay out more lavish executive bonuses. Regardless of your political persuasion, I think we can all agree that there are fundamental power imbalances in all organizations that privilege certain interests over others, and only a few people within the organization have access or influence over the decision-making processes that shape these policies. Now, sometimes this is harmless, necessary, or maybe even a good thing. For example, it's probably a pretty good idea to have some sort of power differential between students and professors if you want to run a good university. But that doesn't mean we should treat all power imbalances as natural or inevitable, just the way it is and the way it's supposed to be. No, power relationships reflect someone's decisions, and we should be able to question who gets to make those decisions, how those decisions were made, and who had access and influence in the decision-making process. Power can come in many forms. Reward power means you control who can get certain rewards, like a promotion or a bonus. Coercive power means you have the ability to force someone to do something because you have the power to punish them for not complying. Referent power is your ability to influence someone because of their loyalty, respect, friendship, admiration, affection, or a desire to gain your approval. Expert power means people will obey you because you are knowledgeable on a particular subject. And legitimate power is derived from a formal position you hold within a hierarchy or bureaucracy. Your textbook lists several other ways to think about power in this table. A few other ideas from critical theory you should be familiar with. First, ideology refers to the taken-for-granted assumptions about reality that influence our perceptions of situations and events, sort of like our worldview, or the idea of big D discourse we learned about in the previous chapter. Ideology is what structures our thoughts and shapes our interpretations of reality. And we often don't even realize our own ideology until we interact with people who have very different ideologies. For example, you may have very specific ideas about what a family is and how a family should function, likely informed by your deep-seated values and beliefs. I certainly do. And it's easy to assume that's just what a family is and how families are supposed to act. And then you meet other people who do family differently, and you realize that yours is just one perspective on families, not simply the way it is. The important thing for organizational communication is how certain ideologies about business, resources, decision-making, or employee relations become taken for granted in organizations and used to legitimate various policies and actions. Like a company that has a very competitive culture with consistent layoffs that is uncritically accepted because of a corporate ideology that says, hey, it's just business, nothing personal. And that's just the way things work around here. That's just the way things work in our industry. A critical theorist says, no, that's the way certain people in power have chosen to do business because it advances their interests. Things could be otherwise. Let's explore where this ideology came from, how it is perpetuated, and how it might be challenged. Next, hegemony is a related concept that refers to the process in which a particular ideology is imposed and sustained by dominant groups, such that subordinated groups come to accept this ideology as the norm. It's the manufactured consent produced by dominant groups and willingly accepted by others, even against their best interests. Like when lower-income people vote for politicians who promise to cut taxes, even though they are the citizens most likely to benefit from increased taxes and government programs. And this is where things get a bit debatable in critical theory. Some people accuse critical theorists of conceptualizing people, especially organizational members, as unsuspecting dupes, mere sheep who blindly follow people in power, as if they aren't smart enough to figure out they are consenting to ideas that are not in their best interests. It's complicated. It certainly is easy to look at other people doing things we think are unusual, like submitting to bad experiences at work, and think they are trapped by a hegemonic ideology. But on the other hand, life is full of trade-offs, and most of us are capable of making difficult decisions in light of competing demands. If I give in and buy a minivan and live in a cookie-cutter planned housing development, have I blindly succumbed to the hegemonic ideology of suburban America? Or have I made a deliberate, intentional, practical trade-off based on convenience, given the difficulties of raising a family in contemporary society and working in an area with an expensive real estate market? I suppose it could go either way. I'd like to think I'm in control of my own decisions, doing what's in my best interest given the practical constraints of my life. But of course, many critical theorists might say, that's just what those in power want you to think, so you'll keep perpetuating the system that keeps them in power. Well, who knows? Whatever the case, ideology and hegemony are important concepts for understanding and explaining many aspects of organizational life, and they provide a conceptual foundation for critiquing and transforming power relationships in organizations. In response to ideology and hegemony, critical theorists call for resistance and emancipation. Resistance involves all the ways in which workers can exert counterpressure on the power and control they experience in organizations. This can include explicit and visible means of resistance, like unionization, strikes, and boycotts, Or it can be more subtle and passive means of resistance, like anonymous websites, worker slowdowns, or informal sarcasm and criticism of general work life at an organization. Emancipation is a more revolutionary move, involving the liberation of people from unnecessarily restrictive traditions, ideologies, assumptions, power relations, identity formations, and so forth, that inhibit personal autonomy and human flourishing. Now, only the most radical critical theorists call for a complete overthrow of those in power. Others instead conceptualize emancipation now as more of a psychological state, where people learn to transcend their circumstances and free themselves of unnecessary constraints in the way they perceive their circumstances and approach their work. Our textbook highlights a key application of critical theory, the concept of concerted control. Given critical theory's emphasis on power, the notion of control is also of significant interest. Lately, scholars have noticed that some attempts to move organizations away from more formal modes of hierarchical control and now use more team-based organizing, ironically can result in more control, as people identify strongly with their teams, and those teams impose discipline on their own members. The theory of concerted control, or team-based control, working in concert, concertive, states that power is embedded in a system of identification and discipline. Workers identify with the values and norms of management and then use these values as a basis for making workplace decisions and disciplining other members of the work team. Basically, workers sometimes end up policing themselves much more harshly than a formal boss would, even though team-based work is more democratic and participatory. I see this all the time in student groups, where students are much tougher on each other and enforcing the team's rules, norms, and values than I am as the formal person in charge with legitimate power in the class. So that's a brief look at critical theory. The other main thing we want to cover in this chapter is a feminist approach to organizational communication. Some scholars see feminist approaches as part of the broader critical approach. Others see feminism as a distinct approach to organizational communication that warrants separate investigation. Either way, it's important for us to consider the role of women and gender in the workplace if we want to develop a fuller understanding of organizational communication. Feminist approaches to organizational communication begin with the basic assumption that organizations, in their traditional bureaucratic forms, are inherently patriarchal, that is, male-centric and controlled by men. And this is certainly a historical fact. But feminist scholars go further, arguing that certain forms of organizing are inherently male and masculine, not just because it happens to be that most of the jobs are done by men, but also that organizations themselves are often governed by a logic of aggressiveness, individuality, rationality, competitiveness, and control, what we might call an ideology of masculinity, thinking back to what we just discussed regarding critical theory. And this masculine ideology becomes hegemonic such that alternative notions of cooperation, emotion, empathy, intuition, and connectedness, usually seen as feminine characteristics, seem out of place or unnatural. And of course, all this happens through communication, thus constituting organizations as masculine and patriarchal, which, by the way, connects us back to Chapter 5 and the communicative constitution of organizations. Take a look at this list in the textbook of additional assumptions shared by scholars who take a feminist approach. This one here is especially relevant for our study of organizational communication. That communication is the process where gender, power, and organization are continuously created through everyday life. So this should give you a good overview of the intellectual commitments of those who take a feminist approach to organizational communication. I encourage you to read through additional key concepts our textbook identifies and develops, including sexual harassment, discourse and women-led businesses, and the notion of disciplined bodies. And as always, the discussion questions at the end of the chapter provide great prompts for your discussion board participation this week. Well, that concludes the various approaches to organizational communication we'll look at in our class. Next, we transition to several processes of organizational communication, starting with socialization processes in Chapter 7.